This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 327, entitled Masculist Rage at the Hated Fluffy Feminist Hypocrites in the Divorce Courts. This is a war issue. Description. This flyer asserts that no culture can survive intact when it financially massacres and destroys the lives of a quarter of its fathers, in capital letters. Sooner or later, men will snap, pick up arms and go on a sex war, assassinating the gender politicians who created these massively unjust gender laws, will murder thousands of feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges, and eventually go into the streets and simply shoot these feminazi vermin who sadistically don't care about the massive gender crimes they are committing in the divorce courts. This flyer says that if the gender laws are not soon made menfair, there will be a sex war. There will be blood, and many feminazis will be killed. It's a warning that the feminazis do not have the luxury to take lightly. Their very lives are at stake. Flyer itself. Something unusual has happened. I don't understand. Bear with me. This has not happened. This is new. Try hitting the link again, see what happens. That time it worked. Computers. Okay, finally. Huh? Wrong flyer. What the hell happened? Get the same problem again. That's the problem when you do something in real time. Things fuck up. I'll try refresh, see if that works. No. I'll just have to do it as it is. Okay. Masculist rage at the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites in the divorce courts. This is a war issue by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Prof. Hugo de Garis at yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Each time I think about the enormity of the outrage committed against divorcing fathers in many Western countries by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites with their sadism against their ex-husbands, the more bitter and hateful, murderously hateful, pick up a rifle and start killing people hateful I feel towards them. This flyer aims to spell out the source of such a hatred, which has all the potential to generate a sex war in which millions of divorce fathers lose patience and decide enough is enough and decide to go to war against the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites who are destroying the lives of a quarter of married fathers. A quarter, in capital letters. Let this fraction sink in. It is stating that not a mere % or so of fathers are financially massacred and have their kids ripped away from them, but one father in 4. 1 in 4! Let that really sink in and ponder on its enormous implications. Common sense says that no culture that financially massacres and destroys the lives of a quarter of its fathers can remain intact. Sooner or later there will be an explosion as men decide the hated feminazi bitches who are doing this to men, these fluffy feminist hypocrites, have to be stopped, with bullets if necessary, because the casualty rate amongst men is, in capital letters, far worse than in a major war. So why is this happening? How did the fluffy feminists get to be in such a position that they are unable to destroy the lives of a quarter of a country's fathers? When the National American Women's Organization was formed, now NOW, National Organization for Women, its leaders, mostly Jewish intellectual feminists like Betty Friedan, the mother of the second wave feminist movement with her book The Feminine Mystique, which appealed to upper middle class women who were bored being housewives in the suburbs with 2 kids off to school and having no career to challenge them, to test their mettle, were contemplating giving divorcing fathers joint custody of the children, but faced a massive revolt from their rank and file members who wanted to keep their traditional manslaving role and to keep custody of their children. So not to destroy NOW at its inception, its leaders bowed to the political and gender role pressure of its fluffy rank and file members. NOW was set up to enable these second wave feminists to have political clout, to get the gender laws changed, and they were very successful. NOW achieved pretty much all the legislative reforms it wanted, particularly in the form of an abortion right, that is, a woman had from the 70s a legal right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, in brackets, a right that men still don't have, the greatest example of sexual discrimination that exists, and not against women, but against men. NOW also pushed for no-fault divorce. That is, a divorce became possible for no other reason than the woman, or man, but 70% of divorces are initiated by the wife, wants out of the marriage, for whatever reason. But in the 70s, and still to a large extent now, what was to happen to the kids if the divorcing husband had become a father? Where would the money come from to support the kids after the divorce? In the early 70s, the gender norms were such that the husband was typically the sole breadwinner and the wife stayed at home raising the kids. But with modern, reliable contraception, the number of kids she was raising was typically 0, 1 or 2, rarely more. So after a few years, the kids were off to kindergarten or primary school, and the traditional wife/mother now had time on her hands. The feminists took control of the divorce courts, pushing for the creation of what is now usually called family courts, which are usually filled with women judges and lawyers who had been deeply influenced by feminist thinking. These feminist judges/lawyers knew nothing about masculism. They were thus monoconscious. They hadn't the slightest inkling of how women oppress men with female financial parasitism, female manslavery, etc. All that kind of masculist type thinking was decades away in the 70s. So what did these feminist family court judges/lawyers do to solve the children problem? For them, men were seen as cash machines. Feminists are conscious of how men oppress women, but not vice versa. So by default, they have traditional expectations of men, that is, seeing men as cash machines, as existing on this earth to pay for women to have babies, either before the divorce or after it. In other words, these feminist family court lawyers/judges had traditional expectations of men and knew nothing about masculist ideas. So who pays for the kids after a divorce? The young mother, in most cases, had not bothered to become career competent in the early 70s. Most women then were what the masculists now label fluffies. That is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. That is, she expects to be able to catch a man-slave in her 20s who has been brainwashed that his role in life is to work for a female as the price he has to pay to get a bit of sex from her from time to time when she decides to be in the mood. So the gender politicians of the time made the following decision. Most women were career incompetent at the time, and most men were career competent. Boys were raised by parents to be man-slaves to women. It was unquestioned by society, by mothers, and certainly by the gender politicians, who feared the size and growing power of the feminist lobby in the early 70s, so gave the feminists essentially everything the feminists wanted. The feminists wanted no-fault divorce and the legal clout to force fathers to pay for the upkeep of children so that their fluffy ex-wives could continue to parasite off men's money after the divorce as they'd been doing before the divorce. From the gender politicians' point of view, particularly those who rewrote the divorce laws, there was not much difference between pre- and post-no-fault divorce laws in terms of who pays for the kids. The father, of course. In the 50s and 60s, the gender roles then were that the father was the breadwinner and the wife was the child raiser. So when no-fault divorce laws came in, the divorce rates skyrocketed as millions of fluffy wives discovered that they could financially massacre their husbands at little cost to themselves by pushing the gender politicians to give the mothers sole custody of the kids with a near certainty, that is about 90% in most Western countries. Force the ex-husband to pay child support, giving him minimal visiting rights, typically 2 weekends a month, giving half of his possessions to his ex-wife. And if the ex-wife has been a real fluffy, then the feminist-dominated family court system would dictate to the ex-husband that he has to pay his ex-wife, his fluffy ex-wife, alimony, so that she could maintain the standard of living she had, thanks to him, after the divorce that she had before the divorce. Millions of men then fell under this feminazi axe, and their suicide rate after divorce shot up to about 10 times the usual male rate, which even under normal times is about 4 times higher than the usual female suicide rate. Some decades later, the gender norms of men, especially young men, have changed. We now have the Masculist movement and the MGTOW, men going their own way movement, which is largely due to as a reaction by young men to the toxicity of the divorce courts taken over by the hated fluffy feminist. The Masculists are much more political and angry than the politically wimpy, passive MGTOWs who simply quietly walk away from marriage and reject paternity. The Masculists, on the other hand, are warriors. They fight! And if the gender roles are not made menfair in the coming few years, there's a growing chance that masculist influenced men will take up arms and start killing their enemies, which are divided into 3 main camps, that is, the gender politicians, who made these horrible gender laws against men, financially massacring them and destroying their lives at the massive rate of 1 father in 4. When the sex war comes, these gender politicians will be assassinated for their massive crimes against men. Next, thousands of fluffy feminist hypocrite, that is, hypocrite because these women act as feminists in the parliaments, pushing for equal rights with men, but act as fluffies in the divorce courts, expecting men to continue to be manslaves to fluffy parasitic ex-wives with no moral or legal obligation on women to fit up and become career competent so that they can pull their weight financially and not expect to parasite off their ex-husbands. Divorce court lawyers and judges will be murdered because it is they who are implementing these horrific laws against men. If the sex war turns into a major scale war, then masculine soldiers will go out into the streets and simply shoot the feminazi vermin for destroying the lives of 1 father in 4. Causing such a rejection of paternity amongst young men that now 2/3 of them in many countries refuse to marry, reject paternity and spend their money on themselves. Thus the fluffy feminists have become indirect genociders, wiping out whole populations, so desperate measures are called for to stop this. If the gender laws are not men-feared, a sex war is inevitable. Millions of feminazis will be murdered in the streets until there is such an outcry that the politicians address men's issues, or they too will be assassinated, along with the gender politicians, who will be the first target of the masculist assassins. Since the crimes of the gender politicians are the greatest, it is they, a small handful of people, who made these horrific misandrist laws, so are the most hated by the masculists and the first to be targeted. If these masculine soldier methods seem extreme to you, consider the fact 1 father in 4 is financially massacred and has his life destroyed by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrite divorce courts, by the gender politicians, by the fluffy feminists, by women in general who still see men as cash machines, to be abused by women, to be robbed and sexploited by women, because it is what women have done to men for several million years. The MGTOWs and masculists know that women don't love men. They know that women love men's sexploitability, what the MGTOWs call the red pill. A husband has no genes in common with his wife, so his wife sees him merely as a cash machine, an exploitable, disposable commodity. If her current husband fails for some reason in his traditional role of being the breadwinner, the man-slave, the gullible workhorse, this is fluffy wife who did not bother to get a career-competent education at high school or college, then she will coldly, quickly, disloyally dump him in favour of a more sexploitable man-slave. He doesn't even have to fail at his traditional man-slave task. If a woman senses there's a realistic chance to monkey branch to a more sexploitable manslave who can provide her with more money, prestige, power, etc., then she will have no qualms about dumping her current man and getting her financial parasitic claws into her new man and give her cunt to him. This is the hypogamous nature of women, who evolved to be like that. In the distant past, a woman who was not like that was at greater risk of starving when game was scarce, and not all male hunters returned with meat. Men are now waking up in droves thanks to the internet and the spread of MGTOW and Masculist ideas. The Masculists are putting enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, that is, become FIPs, financially independent persons, or be forced by Masculist influenced men to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and increasingly spat at for being fluffy vermin, immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, to be wiped out by men totally ignoring them, removing their fluffy parasite genes from the gene pool. Masculists push for the menfairing of the gender laws and the creation of a FIP society, in which girls are socialised by parents and taught by teachers and professors to FIP up or be ostracised by society. As masculism spreads and spreads through Western countries, political and moral pressure on fluffies and the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, to reform the divorce laws, to bring in the para, paternity rejection right, etc., will only grow and grow, so that eventually a tipping point will be reached at which men are so murderously angry at the current one father in four financial massacring in the fluffy feminist divorce courts that a sex war will break out. On a smaller scale, this sex war is already underway. There are constant news reports on the internet that divorced fathers who have had their kids stripped from them and forced to pay alimony to fluffy ex-wives are murdering the fluffy feminist divorce court judges and lawyers at about a rate of one per major city per year. That's several hundred per year in the US. There are reports that these feminazi judges / lawyers are trying to keep such news from spreading, not wanting to put ideas into the heads of other murderously enraged divorced fathers. But thanks to the internet, the MGTOWs and Masculists are talking to each other, raising men's consciousness against the massive 1 in 4 massive gender injustices committed against men, and are getting angrier and angrier, closer and closer to feeling the time is right to hit back, and to hit back hard by undertaking such political actions as A. Writing crime scene against men on the outer walls of family courts. B. Smashing car windows of feminazi divorce court lawyers and judges. C. Setting masculist flash mobs against these lawyers and judges, making their lives a misery by, for example, calling them up at 3 a.m, hacking their internet connections, knifing their tyres, throwing red paint on them, etc. D. Masculist influenced men who are victims of these hated feminazi fluffy feminist hypocrites will be far more dangerous, with many of them simply murdering these feminazi gender criminals, claiming that these men are masculist soldiers fighting the sex war to liberate men from the hated feminazis who are destroying the lives of 1 father in 4. To readers of this flyer, be conscious of the constant repetition of this statistic, 1 father in 4, and think about its enormous consequences. The current gender status quo cannot continue, in capitals. Sooner or later men will snap, and they will go on a murderous rage against the hated feminazis for the enormous gender crimes they have committed, and will take their revenge. In the sex war, thousands of these gender criminals will be murdered. If the feminazis then make desperate pleas to the male politicians and law enforcers to punish these masculist assassins and murderers, that is, these masculist soldiers, then these feminazis need to be conscious that the ultimate backup of the law is male force. But when the male law enforcers themselves become masculists, then the feminazis are fucked. Either the gender laws will be menfaired, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again with the legislated para, joint custody of kids, no alimony, and a social engineering of girls to be forced to fip up or expect to live a manless life, etc. When the male cops go masculist, the feminazis are fucked. They will be useless against male force. Women will then do as women have done for millions of years. They will accept they have no right to ride roughshod over men's rights, men's dignity. Masculists need to teach women, as well as men, that men are not to be manslaves to parasitic females. Women have to fip up or pay a horrible price of being manless. Women really need to have drummed into their heads the masculist slogans. Fip up or be manless. No calculus, no baby. Women need to understand that masculists see fluffies as, quote, immoral, parasitic, manslaving vermin, end quote, to be wiped out by being totally ignored by men, spat at by not only men but by society in general. As women too learn to become female masculists, accepting with men that men's rights will be fought for, with bullets if necessary, in a sex war, unless women give men the same level of rights that women want for women. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, contains links to 300 plus YouTube, Minds, BitChute, Masculist essays / videos, and to the book, Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 300 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Ciao.